Thanks so much for having me, Mike. Appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully this will work as well now as it did in our practice as we got started. So can everybody see that? Okay, great. Yep. Great. Perfect. Well, again, thanks so much for having me. Mike, thanks so much for the invite. Erica, thanks so much for facilitating all of this. And Holly, thanks for helping me with the tech as we got on this morning. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all to talk about data governance and ways to center privacy, equity, and of course, students in that process. And I am thrilled to hear that you actually have students here as a part of your data governance process. So that's great, great news. I have shared a link to this presentation, a Google link to this presentation. So Erica has that, and either, I don't know, Erica in the chat or email afterwards, that can be shared with you all. I have a lot of resources in this presentation. That's really my goal here today, is to share some information that might be useful as you go through your data governance process, and some resources that have been helpful both for me, but also for thinking through how we should approach data use from an equitable way and foregrounding privacy in that process. So feel free to ask questions in the chat through Erica, and I will answer those as much as I can. My setup right now, I can't see the chat very well, so those may have to come to at the end, but if there's something really dire that is coming up, please feel free to, raise hands, shake hands, bug Erica, and then you can get to me. So a little bit about me, if this will allow me to forward my slides. There we go. So as Mike mentioned, I am a senior policy analyst at SHIO, previously worked at the Future of Privacy Forum on post-secondary data privacy, and I've done research on post-secondary data privacy policies in higher education institutions and their uses of learning analytics and other early alert systems. I also teach occasionally at George Mason University in the higher education program. And what's on here is I actually worked in administration as a strategic planning manager in the president's office for a few years at George Mason as well. So I have that perspective and that lens, the perspective to my research agenda, which really gets at ways to use data and post-secondary data systems equitably, to advance equity, to advance access, and to improve outcomes, both for our institutions, but also for our students and our other state stakeholders. Okay, so jumping in today, today I'm going to be talking about data governance. And when I talk data governance, yes, I'm talking about broad data governance for the institution, but also what data governance means on an individual level. So how you as an individual are engaging in this governance process, both sort of through your university and your system, but also sort of what that data means to you and how you govern your own use of data day to day, and the use of data by others day to day. So to begin, we'll talk a bit about why this all matters. We'll get into defining data privacy, and then go through briefly some of the laws, just brief overview of some of the laws, regulations, and principles and how they map to some of the work we do. Talk a bit about data justice and equity, and then some recommendations for practice. And then again, those resources at the end that I'll link you to. Okay, so why does data privacy matter? Well, if you have been looking at the news at all in the past few years, between target breaches, data analytica breaches, sometimes breaches at our own institutions, data breaches happen. Sometimes data is not used as well as it could be, not protected as well as it could be. And this becomes particularly challenging as we move everything to sort of online virtual cloud spaces. And we have a rapidly advancing ability to collect and use and share individual level data. There's also an increased use of platforms to sort of hold and share data, and surveillance technologies that we're using in a host of different industries to include education. And this is not all bad, right? Like, data is really useful. It can really be used to inform practice and improve outcomes, especially if we use it thoughtfully and disaggregate the data. We can advance the use of data and advance equity through equitable use of data. And so because of that, it's become increasingly valuable. It's an increasingly valuable resource or commodity even for institutions and for third parties. So we really need to be thinking about how we are protecting this data. Within this ability, or within this ecosystem of data, there's also greater security threats because of the value of their data and individual privacy. So those breaches that happen are really sort of a driver of some of the public interest and response. So There has been growing public interest in response to the privacy threats, growing interest in what's being collected by individuals about what's being collected about them and how that's being protected. And also, because of that, an evolving landscape of federal and state privacy laws and regulations. So the Federal Trade Commission is currently looking at these, at developing guidance around data and data platforms like Facebook and others. And then also sort of how creating a national legislator guidance around this use. Right now, we have a patchwork of state laws and regulations. Many of these laws have developed, and I'll talk about that in a bit, in the past few years, as states try to advance data protections for individuals. Okay, so oops, let me go back. It skipped ahead a lot. All right, so we also have data privacy as data and privacy as ability. Sorry, I should say data privacy and equity. Data privacy can strengthen practice outcome and equity efforts, but it's also tied to notions of power, right? So within data systems, the person collecting the data often has more power and insight into that information than the person who's collected from, the data subject. In higher education, this would be the student, right? So there can be a greater potential for harm through data systems, especially for folks from marginalized groups. Chris Gilliard has done a lot of good work in this area around digital redlining, and I have a link to one of his papers at the end of this presentation, where through surveillance technologies, through data systems, oftentimes people of color, specifically Black people, are often harmed at greater rates than white folks in this country through the use of data. And so being really thoughtful about how we're using data to advance and not to harm. And this is especially important in higher education because part of our job is a duty of care for our students, and that should extend to the use of their data. And also because students care about data privacy. Recently in Inside Higher Ed, Melissa Zarek wrote a paper based on a survey of student thoughts on their data privacy. And they want to know what's being collected about them and how it's being used and how that's informing decisions that are being made through early alert advising systems, et cetera. So all of these reasons are sort of driving the interest in privacy and equity as it's tied to data governance and should be underpinning the decisions we make in that space. So I'm going to describe data privacy here just briefly. So it's basically the right to have some control over how your information is used and collected. Your personal information is used and collected. It, of course, is tied to security. Security is sort of the how things are secured, how they're protected. Privacy is your role or your ability to sort of make some decisions within that process. And privacy focuses on how that personally identifiable information is used and governed within a space. So certainly security is important, but I would argue that privacy is sort of the meat to all of this and really the driver and is the reason why the security exists, right? And so this is going to lay some of the groundwork for the equity conversations we have as I move through this presentation. A quick overview of some of the privacy laws and regulations that exist in this country, but are being informed by laws and regulations outside of the country. So I'm sure you are all familiar or have heard about FERPA at one point or another, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act of 1974. This is a big one. In a recent SHIO survey that we did, our Strong Foundation survey, this is by far the policy that's most mentioned by state systems and their institutions for protecting student data, or the regulations they most think about. HIPAA this last year has definitely ticked up the list when we think about issues associated with the pandemic and health data that may have been collected through that time. There are some other standards. There's this NIST cybersecurity framework that acts as a guide that some states and systems are paying attention to. And then of course, any state regulations or laws. So the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, that was sort of like the first big one, especially for education in the United States, and has informed the way we think about privacy and the rights that are afforded to students within that system. And it has done a very good job historically. The challenge is data are changing and data systems have changed, and modern systems really aren't covered as well as they should be by FERPA. FERPA has been long overdue for a rewrite. It's actually been up in Congress a few times and been kind of pushed with everything that's going on. So it may come back around in this next year to be rewritten. But the challenge with FERPA is it sort of envisions data as these static records, and I'll talk a bit about that more in a moment. It envisions data as a static record, sort of things that are stored on a shelf and then maybe sent off to Iron Mountain or another warehouse and stored in perpetuity until they need to be destroyed, right? What is missing from FERPA, and I will also say it does give certain rights to students and their families, especially if it's students under the age of 18, the right to correction, the right to redress, the right for notification. So you have some rights for the individual here, but they're really limited. And they don't get to some of the bigger rights that are necessary as we think about modern data systems. And I'll talk about a few of those in a second. There has been movement lately, just in the last couple of years. The California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, is a big one. It sort of, has prompted a lot of other states to create their own versions of this law. But this law is really getting at expanding the rights of consumers so that they have other rights within the space related to their data. So the right to be forgotten, so to not participate, the right for deletion of data, the right to non-discrimination. And there are other rights associated with this. The CCPA was based on GDPR, and there's a lot of tie over. In the resources, I have some connections there between the two and a resource that talks about GDPR specifically in higher education. So there are a lot of these regulations that exist in these spaces, many of which are focused on process and sort of more institutionally focused for how we should be working with data. Few are really focused beyond basic rights on what rights the individual has. And so that's something I'll talk about as we go through the rest of our talk and ways about centering the individual, in our case, the student, and hopefully improving equity through that process. So all of these regulations I just talked about inform institutional privacy policies in higher education. So as part of a research project I did with Mike Brown, he's an assistant professor at Iowa State University and a fabulous researcher and colleague. But we did a policy discourse analysis of privacy policies for many institutions in higher education. And we read through their privacy policies, and we found that there were a few challenges with the privacy policies, partly because they were based on sort of the norms of FERPA and the legal system. First, again, they position data as static records. Well, we know in modern data systems, data are not static records, they are evolving sources of information. So you've got these legacy representations of dynamic systems, and it's a mismatch. There are also assumptions around risk mitigation, which makes sense, right? We do not want to be responsible for a data breach and for any student information being sent out there and potentially harming someone. So there is this notion of institutional responsibility, but it is always responsibility and risk mitigation that is institutionally focused and rarely student focused. It also assumes student awareness and agency, and oftentimes that just isn't the case. I'm going to skip down one, and it isn't the case because oftentimes these policies are poorly communicated. They're hidden on IT pages, rarely mentioned to students. Students aren't involved in their process of development. They use legalese and obscure language. But even more than that, how many of us really know? Like, I know that when I go on, if I just need to use an app or I need to use a program, I will scroll down, I'll say, yeah, I'll read through this. This is all sort of boilerplate language. I'll click accept and we'll go on. Rarely before I started thinking about privacy did I read through privacy policies. Now I do. I encourage my students to. I encourage my child to. In fact, he's required to before he's allowed to download a new app onto his phone. And so it's a matter of thinking through how we are communicating this information to students, because they aren't necessarily aware. They don't necessarily know, and they don't have enough of the information necessarily to be active agents in the use of their data in this process. And then legitimate educational interest is institutionally defined and really broadly applied. So there are a number of third parties we work with, many of whom we have great opportunities to work with and are great partners in this space. But maybe we aren't aware of how they're dealing with privacy. Maybe we haven't tapped into that a bit more. But beyond our partners, where we hopefully have some fairly deep conversations through our IT offices about their privacy protections in addition to their security protections, in classrooms sometimes, and students sometimes will be like, oh, there's a great app. Let me just download that, or download this app to do your homework or to turn in a homework assignment. I would encourage you as you're thinking about having those, using those apps and having those conversations, to look at the privacy policy, to ask your students to look at the policy privacy statements. So the privacy policy statements, so that they are thinking about, okay, where is my data going? Who holds it? And how are they using it? So for instance, if we think of Turnitin, if students are uploading their information to Turnitin, that intellectual property, their paper, it's debatable who owns that at that point. So thinking through those sorts of questions. And again, this is especially important when we think about advising systems. So, or any sort of system where we are determining an outcome for someone, that institutions understand and are communicating with their students how they should be using this information to inform outcomes. And that so students are really getting an understanding what data is being used, how it's being used, and what decisions that are being made about them. And then also understand how to maybe push back or question those decisions. All right, so all of these policies are informed and have historically been informed by the Fair Information Practice Principles. And this starts to get at some of those rights that I was talking about just a moment ago, those individual rights that sometimes aren't really explicated all that well through policy, historical policy. And this gets it sort of in your day-to-day practice. So you've got your governance, you've got your policy, but in your day-to-day practice, what does that look like and how can it translate? And so these are called FIPS. So the FIPS have evolved over time, but they basically get at the idea of we want to limit data collection, right? So do we really need to be scanning student eyeballs? Do we need biometric data for a student to be able to access a meal in the dining hall? That has happened at some places. At my former, at George Mason University when I was a student there. You know, do we need that information, or is that information that we actually don't need? We just need to maybe have them swipe their student ID card, right? What does the quality of the data look like? And I would say here from equity perspectives, is that data disaggregated? Do we really understand how this data is relevant and quality for the various populations groups we're looking at? And that we're not just bucketing into large populations groups, or really disaggregating down to subcategories within categories. That we're using them for specific purposes. We're not repurposing information. One of the challenges with large data sets is they can be shared, combined, repurposed at any time. And so historically, what would have been like, here are your grades in one moment in time, they're in a record and we store them away. Now that information can not only follow you, but be integrated into new and different systems for the rest of your life and even beyond. So how are we being really specific about the purposes, and are we limiting our data collection and use to that purpose? And are we safeguarding that information? Are we being open? Are we communicating? Are we allowing individuals to participate in the process? And are we ensuring we have a diverse group of students and other faculty, staff, administrators around the table, so we're making decisions that are inclusive of a variety of perspectives? And that we have some accountability, right? We report out how we're using this information, and we talk about that, and we have audit and assessment processes. So a way to get at individuals, because the FIPS is great, and it's helpful for talking about how we can begin to think about our responsibilities to users and their data, but it doesn't get necessarily to the rights of users. And so this is recent work that's been done in the last 5 years by Lynette Taylor. She is amazing. She has a couple of great videos on YouTube. I highly recommend, if you look up data justice and Lynette Taylor, you can find her. But she came up with these tenets of data justice, and there are 3 main ones with some subcategories. And this starts to get at some of those rights that we see in the California Privacy Act, the GDPR, around issues of visibility, engagement with technology, and non-discrimination. So we start with visibility. Do we have access to representation, that an individual can sort of access how they're being represented in the space or by a data system? That they have informational privacy, that there's an ability for them to sort of opt out of technology and systems, that they're able to engage with technology so they can share in the benefits of that technology, but they also have autonomy and choices. So they're not just able to opt out, but they are able to be partners in the decision-making around the use of their information. This is really an important one, I think, for education, right? Because the goal of education is development and to help develop individuals. And so the only way we can truly do that is that by incorporating them into the process and into the learning process about their information, how it's being used, and how they can be a part of crafting that in that process that will benefit them in the long run. And then of course, non-discrimination, also really important for what we do, so that individuals have the ability to challenge bias and prevent discrimination. Now, data justice is very, very much tied to data equity. And it's sort of like, it's the rights piece of that data equity. And data equity is sort of, to me, is the idea of the process and how that plays out. So I pulled this piece from Digital Promise. They have a new work they're doing on a data playbook. Digital Promise is a little more K-12 focused. However, this particular slide I think is really helpful in thinking about, from a governance and use perspective, what things we need to be thinking about in education as we engage folks toward a more student-centered and equity-centered and privacy-centered approach to governance. So it's thinking about, when we think about data equity, it's thinking about ways to center the voices of the folks we're collecting data about, particularly data subjects, in our case, students, but also centered those who are from marginalized groups and they're most marginalized. So we're thinking about sort of what the greatest harm can be done and then mitigating that from the get-go. So that when we're thinking about data collection, we have that holistic understanding of a student experience. We're not sort of thinking about data in a vacuum, but we're thinking about it in context. And we're not thinking about privacy and equity in a vacuum, but within the context. And that we should be really looking at what will advantage groups, rather disadvantage or exclude groups. When we're analyzing data, disaggregating data, I will say this a million times a day, disaggregate data to understand what's happening to distinct populations and consider those historical contexts, because data really are another form, it's another social structure, right? And so as with any social structure, it is imbued with some bias, it's imbued with specific values and perspectives. And usually of a dominant group, right? So how then can we bring in maybe disparate voices or different voices who have historically not been a part of that process to dismantle some of those inequitable structures that exist within data systems? And then make sure we're doing that through the interpretation and data sharing process, so that we're being open and we're protecting people, but also being able to provide information that can advance equitable outcomes for folks. And that when we're making decisions, that we really include people at the table. That's one of the reasons I said I was glad to see students are in this conversation today, because we really want students to be included here, but also included can be members of our student affairs division, our equity offices, our auxiliary enterprises office, our faculty members, that we're bringing in a variety of different perspectives as we come together to advance the goals of appropriate and equitable data use on campus. All right, and so I'm gonna, here as a quick example, I wanted to share this as a resource, and after this, I'm gonna get into some recommendations for thinking through how, what to address and how to address that as you're working on data governance and practice issues in the CU system. But I wanted to share this. I recently had a visit out to one of our members, one of your neighbors, the Utah State System of Higher Education, and they recently developed this equity lens framework that they're using. It might be difficult to see the wording here, and so if you want to look in that in the Google version that I shared with Erica, that might be helpful. But what the system did is they said, look, we really want to advance equity in this space. We want to advance the student experience and make sure our students are receiving equitable access and outcomes. And one of the ways we need to do this is through assessing our approach, but then really looking at our data. And so this data piece here in particular and how they use that to inform practice, I think is really useful and can be really useful as you're thinking about how you want to approach your data governance process. And so it's thinking about, are you thinking about representation? Have you understood the impacts of the data sources you're using on things like on various demographics? Do you need to pull in some qualitative data? Should we match some of this quantitative information we have with qualitative data? And are you interrogating sort of those data, that data information you have, to make sure that it is, quality data and that it is as impartial or as unbiased as it can possibly be? And then using that to plan, implement, measure success. So hopefully that's a helpful resource for you. I was really blown away by their work. The link I have in the resources actually lists the full plan, and this is just a little summary of it, so you can find that there and read through it when you have time. So some recommendations for practice. First, articulate data privacy and equity vision. This is really important. This is part of the data privacy by design approach, also linked to in your resources. There's a lot of information out there, and I wanted to distill it, but also give you some resources to go away with. But it's important to have a shared understanding. That's part of what you're doing here, right, in this workshop, is creating a shared understanding of what you mean when you say data privacy and what you mean when you say data equity. And moving forward with that, having that be sort of the lodestar for the work that you're doing as you move forward. And then starting with data privacy and equity in mind. So this is important that in any conversation you have related to post-secondary data or technology systems on campus, any conversation you're having, you're starting with, okay, what are the implications, the data privacy implications? What are the data equity implications? What are those? How can we mitigate those? How can we use this as a lever to advance the outcomes that we want that are in that shared vision? And then advocating for data privacy and equity. So if you are in meetings and these conversations aren't coming up, having those conversations. If you're in your classroom and an issue of data is coming up or a new technology is coming up, or as I said, you're asking your students to use a different app outside of maybe Blackboard or whatever LMS or early alert system you have, you're having conversations about data privacy and equity in that space. That you're fostering inclusive data governance, as you are already today, by incorporating students, as I said, those other members of campus. Another really important piece here is to make data privacy and equity everybody's job. And there are a few ways you can do that, right? You can do it through training, really great, bring in some trainers, have some conversations around data privacy, have some conversations around data equity. You can also start creating some data literacy opportunities, and I'll talk about that more in a second, but certainly for staff, admin, and faculty, if there's opportunities for data literacy connections, that can be really useful. And then also, as it relates to this, not just the training and the data literacy, but also building it into how we assess not just things, but people's use of data. And so that might be a bit more controversial. It might be a conversation you have to have with HR. But how can this be built into maybe annual evaluations or things like that? What sort of efforts have you made toward improving data privacy and data equity in the work that you're doing? Not as a stick, as a carrot. To just encourage that thinking and that mindset as you go through. Vet third-party vendors and apps. This is a big one. Our IT offices on campuses do a great job of this. They're typically having these conversations, but higher education has a massive market value and massive buying power as a collective. And so when working with vendors and apps saying, okay, hey, so let's talk data privacy. Let's talk about data equity. What are your policies? What's your privacy policy? Does that align with ours? If that doesn't align with ours, we may need to ask you to augment that so that when you are using our data or our students' information, that you're protecting that data the way we are. Most of this is done typically. The challenge comes when you're using applications or other sort of one-off things where that becomes a little more challenging, right? And so that's where it's needing to make sure that as an instructor, as a student, as a staff, faculty member, advisor, whomever, that you're really thinking through, okay, what am I asking my students to do this? Do I really need to ask them? Or if I go back to those FIPS things about data collection and minimization, is there another way for me to get information about my students or have them engage in a technology or in data collection that won't necessarily, provide sort of an opening to their data and security, right? So those are a few starts. And then what I'd also say, so in my dream world, we're building a world where data privacy and equity are actually built into the curriculum, right? We've got a gen ed requirement that gets folks here because we are only moving more and more into a world that's governed by data. I'm sure you may have all seen that Facebook is now becoming Meta and the metaverse. I have no idea what any of that actually means in practice. But it is sort of a nod to the fact that we are going full throttle ahead into a very data-informed future where data is a commodity and it is a huge value. And so individuals need to understand where they sit in that space. And if we think of privacy and data as a power structure, how they can use the agency they have within that and the power that they have within that system to ask questions, push back, shape that future. Also, I have a link in here in the presentation that you'll be able to access One of the ways I do this as I start conversations, and I have conversations through my syllabus privacy statement. I put this in all of the syllabi that I do when I teach. It's an opportunity for me to just sort of start the conversation with students. I talk about how we're going to use data and systems like Zoom, for instance, in the classroom, and where they should be at with privacy. But then I also encourage them to find out more about how data is used on their campus and to reach out to ask questions. So you're welcome to use that syllabus statement. For those of you who teach, if you'd like to use that syllabus statement, please feel free to borrow that. Some of that's informed by some work by some colleagues, Autumn Keynes and Aaron Glass. Autumn is at University of Michigan, Dearborn, and has done a lot on remote proctoring lately, some really fantastic work on remote proctoring. I recommend you look up her work, but I would just ask that you attribute them if you're using any of that language. Be transparent and tailor messaging. So this gets to that piece when I talked a long time ago about the work Mike and I did, that students can't find information about what they're working on or the privacy policies online, or they don't understand it because it's super legally. So just make sure you're communicating with students in a way that they'll understand, in spaces that they'll be able to hear it. And of course, undergo regular data privacy and equity assessments and disaggregate data. And I'd say just ask yourself the questions that I have here. Anytime you're using data or technology, or anytime you're thinking about creating a policy that's going to govern use of data and technology, ask these questions. Am I minimizing harm and maximizing student potential? And why do I need this information? Who or what is centered in the process? Who's missing and who's benefiting? Finally, this is a quick one. I'm just going to show you a really great way of a data forward privacy and equity example is University of Michigan. They have VisiBlue. It's a really awesome tool that they've created to communicate how they're using data on campus. I have a link to this in the resources. I encourage you to check that out. They do some phenomenal work around centering privacy and equity and conversations around those issues related to the data work that they're doing on campus. Lots of resources and references, and I know I've said a lot, so happy to chat with you now if there are any questions in the chat.
There are, Carrie, thank you so much. That was amazing. And I actually have a number of questions that have come through, and everyone, I know I just put a reminder in there. If you do have any additional questions, please feel free to send them to me directly so we can get them to Carrie. And if we don't have time for them today, I will be sending them along to her as well. So Carrie, the first question we got was about sovereignty and individual sovereignty over one's data. What role does that play in data governance in your experience?
Yeah, so it really hasn't played much of one until recently, right? So I think in data systems, we, especially in systems where, an individual's data is being collected, there's an agreement. So for instance, if you're a student and you come to a campus, there's an agreement that yes, I'm coming, and yes, you can collect information about me and use that to help me through my process. But there hasn't been as much information about that. I think that's why the work of Lynette Taylor was developed, why she started developing this work, and she and others, there's some other folks who've done work on informational privacy, and why data equity is becoming such a big deal. Because there is sort of a notion of how much agency does an individual have when they're working in a space, if any, and honestly, there's a conversation to have is, will we ever have any true individual data sovereignty when we work and exist in shared data systems that cross a lot of different sectors and information is shared all the time. In education, at least, we're able to lock that down a bit more. But that's where needing to sort of really foreground the rights of individuals and start creating collaborative approaches to data governance is really important, so that we are allowing spaces for people to be able to make informed decisions. And if one of their informed decisions is to say, I do not want to be a part of this collection process, or I want to opt out of this, so they understand, okay, if I opt out, that means I may not be able to have the advising experience that I could have, and that might limit some of the opportunities that I have. And there may be good reasons why I want to limit my interaction with the system. And so I think that's the space that we need to trust our students and ourselves as consumers and folks whose data is collected about ourselves to be able to make some decisions, as long as we're making informed decisions and providing folks with all of the information that we can, so they can make it as informed decisions as possible related to their sovereignty within a space. Hopefully that answers the question.
I was going to say that actually leads in perfectly to the next question I received about one of your earlier slides where you noted the legitimate educational interest.
Right.
And the person said, this is a phrase I've heard before, but what exactly does that mean? And how can a university effectively balance that legitimate educational interest or need with risk?
Right. So what does that mean? It can mean a whole host of things. And that's one of the challenges. And that's where the role of data governance is so important in establishing who gets to have access, who is a legitimate educational actor. So a legitimate educational actor may be an administrator, maybe a student affairs employee who needs to provide some support or coaching, maybe a faculty member who's has access to grades and is providing some advising and support. But it may also be a third-party vendor, right? If you have an early alert system on your campus, if you are Blackboard, if you're using an LMS system on your campus, that is also a legitimate educational actor that can share data. State systems, right? Those are that you share data with so that we can do reporting to the federal government. Those are all legitimate actors within the space. What's important when we're working with a legitimate educational actor, whether that's a third internal member of our community, a stakeholder, a partner, or a third-party vendor, that we're really making sure that we are all on the same page when we're talking about issues of privacy and security. So some of those NIST cybersecurity frameworks, the HECVAT, EDUCAUSE, that's in one of the links. EDUCAUSE has a HECVAT, it's a vendor assessment tool. That can be helpful in starting those conversations. Those are more security focused, but that you're having conversations about how you're using data, who's centered in that process, who's harmed, and so that you're all on the same page and you're making sure that you're making decisions as collaboratively as possible. I think that other than disaggregating data, collaboration is probably another word of the day.
It's interesting. It's like you're mind reading some of the questions that I have.
It's like I studied this or something, Erica.
So, with that in mind, and you're mentioning third-party vendors and apps, and, and we think about how much we've started to use OPMs like Coursera, how do you get software vendors to work with you on this data privacy and some of the opt-outs? What are the risks to our data with those? And can we dictate how our data is then used by these large third-party vendors?
Yeah, it's really challenging, right? And it depends on the vendor and depends on the context. It also depends on again, I'll get back to that, if you can leverage your buying power in the market. But oftentimes it's difficult. If a vendor comes to you and says, hey, I have a solution here, but this is what I'm offering. This is the way we do it. You may have some difficulty. And that's when, as an institution, you're faced with a choice. Okay, do we engage because we need to have an LMS. We need to have this in place. Or do you say, okay, we need to have a really thoughtful conversation here? I will say, I think that many technology and especially ed tech companies are becoming increasingly aware of the data privacy and equity conversations that are out there, certainly with the Federal Trade Commission's involvement in this. And they just have a new commissioner that was brought in and is very pro data privacy. I think these conversations, will be having more of these conversations. But I think that because many tech vendors are also working in the K-12 space where there are much more sort of strict rules around data privacy and data privacy, you can start having those conversations. I will say sometimes it's difficult, but I think starting by having the conversation and collaborating to make that happen is really important. And then again, you're at a decision point. Do we go forward with the technology knowing that maybe it's not meeting our standards? Is that the best choice? Or do we say thanks, and do we look at other options that might be out there to see if we can find another option that provides us that choice but also meets our standards? And I would say, if we are centering students in this process and we're thinking about minimizing harm, coming back to that time and time again, and saying to our vendors, we are thinking about our students, we're minimizing harm, we're thinking about how this data is going to be used and collected. And also that we as an institution own the data. Now there's another conversation about, does the institution own the data or does the student own the data? But when it comes to you and sort of an outside actor, having that information remain with the institution when that partnership no longer exists is really important.
You know, it's interesting that you say that. So how do you see the move then to give back ownership of data to students or learners? This is happening with blockchain technology. You know, if students don't own their data, just like they own their learning experience or certificates, how would something like CU move in that direction?
Yeah, well, I will say, I don't know if that's, necessarily the direction that we need to go in full stop, right? Because I do think there's a value in institutions. There is a value when institutions are really working to act in equitable and equity forward and appropriate ways. I think there is a value to the institution. So while I think there's some value in blockchain for portability of information, I do think there's still a value in this institution being involved in that process. So I think it's important to understand that, yes, there are multiple stakeholders in the use of educational data, because while that information is student information, it's also tied to academic information within a system and within an institution. And so a lot of that crosses over, right? And so it can get pretty complex. I think for me, it's just having those conversations and making sure folks are at the table and involved, and again, have a certain amount of ability to be able to say, I'm fine being in that system, I'm fine using my data, or I want to opt out completely. I think that's sort of, for me, where it's at. So it's that having that conversation so that we can start listening to student voices, centering student voices, and understanding where the overlap between institutional needs for information and student needs for informational agency overlap. I don't know, it was kind of a convoluted answer to that question, but hopefully it's helpful.
It was convoluted, but it actually leads directly into two other questions.
Okay, there you go.
So what discussions have you seen, or policies or practices have you seen around the use of adaptive learning tools, systems, or courses? How could we balance this kind of need for external metrics?
Yeah, so that's challenging. And I will say that I have not seen a ton in that space. And I will say I haven't been as focused as much on that aspect as I have been on sort of the early alert and early warning system. So I don't know if I can speak to that. I will say, as with many things in education around data and big data systems, we're a bit behind sort of where the consumer space is. And so I think there's going to be a lot of movement in the space as we move forward. I think in the last year or so, especially with the pandemic, as we moved online, I think there's been a lot of thought about, okay, our operational move, whether we're talking about course delivery or we're talking about, remote proctoring or just online learning generally, and how data are collected in those spaces with partners and third parties, how we're thinking about data and privacy in those spaces. I think that's going to be of increasing attention and will have to be thought through. And that's why some of those fair information principles I talked about, those FIPS principles, are really important to come back to, because that can help guide the work. So whether you're talking about a specific technology or course delivery, or you're talking about we're tracking students' locations every time they open their phone on campus, and we know where a student exists in physical space on campus and what they've checked out and whether or not they swiped into their residence hall or they stayed somewhere else. When we have all that information, are we using the FIPS principles to guide our practices, and are we ensuring that students' rights are being sort of foregrounded in that process?
And actually, that's perfect. We have time for one last question, and in particular about students. Students are not paid to understand or manage these systems, nor are they required to. And it also, to a certain extent, presumes similar and uninclusive backgrounds. How does that factor into data governance?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time for me?
Sure. So students aren't paid to understand or manage these systems, and these types of data governance, as we've been talking about, it kind of presumes a similar background among students, that we've kind of just got data as an all-encompassing term.
Right.
How does something like that factor into data governance? What should we be looking for when we start to put together processes and policies?
Sure. So this is where I think, as much as you can engage with a data privacy officer, and that's the data privacy officer work that's out there, even if you don't have one, that can be really beneficial. I will tell you, the folks at Michigan, and that's that VisiBlue information, do a great job on this, about thinking through how they're using data across different groups and how those groups are constructed. And So this is where that not only disaggregating data is important, so we make sure we have a clear information about that, but we're working with data privacy officers or other experts in the space to really understand the implications of privacy and equity as are associated with data systems. I do think in particular, yeah, students aren't paid to be doing this work. They don't know. That's where data literacy can become really an important lever here. As we think about ways to increase sort of boots on the ground training. I will say Future Privacy Forum has a train the trainer program. If any of you are interested, I can recommend that, where they go through data privacy issues that can be really useful in thinking about post-secondary spaces and their use of data and information. But I think that, again, I would just say, if you use those fair information practices, if you go to the privacy by design principles that are linked in their resources, and you combine those with that perspective of data justice and data equity, to think through what your approaches are to this work, I think that that's really helpful. And reminding folks that when they're using data, that students aren't a monolith, that we have a very diverse group of students, and even within that diversity, there's further diversity, I think is really important. I don't know if that actually answered the question. So if there's an angle to that, that would be helpful to get at.
Yeah, that was one of those, it's kind of a loaded question to a certain extent. I really do want to thank you for all of this. Like I had said, everybody, I'm going to be forwarding. I know I have a couple more questions that have come through. I'll definitely be passing them on. Terry, I think it was, and Brad both put some excellent things in the main chat for everyone that I do recommend checking out and looking at. Terry's got a great kind of excellent use case scenario of data informing our operational excellence. So that's really nice to see. Mike, I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Carrie, very much. I think.
I hope.
Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm not putting my, top 5 or 6 issues in as we go through the rest of the morning, and the breakout groups are all of our participants are, but I know that you changed a number of those for me, and it's like, oh, that's fine, but no, this is more important. Oh, that's mine's good, but Carrie's is better. It raises a higher standard, and so you did exactly what I hoped you would do in expanding my thinking, giving us more resources, and causing me to think more critically about what my personal priorities might be as I think through this process. So that's why I say thank you, I think.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you today. And look, equity work generally is challenging and complex, and data equity work and data privacy work is equally so. So I just am thrilled that you all are engaged in this process, and wish you the best of luck, and happy to be a resource to anybody on the call, and feel free to shoot me an email at the end of